Now, like I mentioned at the end of the last episode, while men have to make money to prove their worth and to get their patriarchal dividends, women have to spend money to prove theirs. So you thought this was going to be a happy ending and the end of that statement, which I left on a cliffhanger in the last episode. You thought that was going to be something happy? No. Think again. Think again. Because what patriarchy does is it absorbs every rebellion, every revolution, every counteraction into its logic. So when women became free agents, free economic agents, patriarchy recalibrated and interacted with capitalism to rebrand consumption as female empowerment. And this is the perfect form of enslavement because consumerism, as I'm going to talk about in this episode, is a form of slavery because we all think it's a form of freedom. But look at your makeup drawer, look at your closet, look at the aesthetics that you adhere to, look at the labels that you place on yourself. The clean girl, or the Pilates princess, or being brat. That's kind of a little bit outdated now. And right now, the King Kylie era is making a comeback. So consumerism is just a shiny, sparkly, tantalizing version of slavery. And it's been rebranded in a way that makes us think that it's a form of freedom. And even worse, as a form of empowerment. Welcome to all the new and returning baddies. If you are new here, I do my intro like once every 10 episodes because I keep forgetting. My name is Nikki. I am your host and the baddest bitch in the building, not to be confused with you, who is also the baddest bitch in the building. And this podcast is all about how to hack the patriarchy, find its loopholes, exploit them, use them to our advantage, find its cracks, weaken them, and basically understand the way this system works so well that we understand how to hack it. Because when you understand its code, that's when you're able to reprogram it. All right, I call that dismantling it from the inside. So this is part 4 of my 5-part series on the toxic relationship between capitalism and patriarchy. If you haven't watched the first 3 episodes, I highly suggest you do that. This episode will still make sense if you don't watch those 3, but it will be a better experience for you if you do. But the world is your oyster. You can do whatever you want. And might I suggest that if you like the episodes you've been hearing so far, I am going to guarantee you are going to love my bonus episodes even more. I drop several bonus episodes every month on Patreon, and they're just more unhinged, more unfiltered, more controversial than the things I talk about publicly, because that's my safe space to run my mouth a little bit. So be sure to check that out, because listen, if you like these episodes, you're going to love those ones. Now, where were we? In the last episode, we discussed how patriarchy, capitalism, and second wave feminism accidentally made men obsolete in a way. And that discussion was all about how the formula that I've been talking about like a broken record for the last 3 episodes breaks down when women are no longer dependent on men. If you're just jumping into this series, that formula that I'm referring to is what I call the magic formula of servitude, which is how patriarchy and capitalism were sort of set up to interact with each other. And that formula is women submitting to men, men submitting to capitalism, and capitalism submitting to patriarchy. And that's a recent phenomenon. It's a recent relationship that arose with the Industrial Revolution. Now, that formula started to break down with second wave feminism when men were cut out as the middleman between women and capitalism, and women were able to engage with the system as both producers and consumers because they could both work and have disposable income to be able to spend money as a consumer. Not to say that no woman ever worked until the 1960s to 80s, but generally speaking. A lot of this is generally speaking and a general observation from trends of social change over the last 200 and so years. With the rise of second wave feminism, women in many parts of the world were able to work, open a bank account, buy property, and although these are things that seem mundane to us today, they were pretty revolutionary for our grandmothers. So obviously it's not something that I want to take for granted. For example, in Canada where I live, married women weren't allowed to open a bank account without their husband's consent until 1964, which is a few years before my parents were born. So that puts a lot of things into perspective for me. That happened within the lifetime of a lot of my living relatives. Now, consumerism rebranded as empowerment. In order to really understand this and understand what the hell I'm talking about, we need to first revisit the 1980s, which in my opinion is the best decade of music ever, but possibly one of the worst decades for economic policy. I was born in 1997, so I'm not going to pretend like I experienced this, all right? A girl did some research to be able to talk about this stuff. I know there are a lot of baddies here who are older than me and who were out and about in the 1980s, so I feel like I'm about to mansplain the 1980s to you. But stick with me. So, in 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected President of the United States. And of course, with any male historical figure who I mention on this podcast, we have to play smash or pass. Honestly, he's a Republican, so I have to say pass. But from like a distance, if you look at him kind of like really fast, low-key a smash. Low-key a smash. But not when you get too close. Anyway, now that I have corrupted your minds and disgusted everybody, let's continue. So Reagan is elected President of the United States, and at the same time, Margaret Thatcher is serving as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. That doesn't work. Of the United Kingdom. I'm glitching. But yeah, so, God, this is already chaotic and we haven't even gotten to the crux of the matter. Okay. Reagan, President of the US in the 1980s, Thatcher, Prime Minister of the UK in the 1980s. The economic shift that happened during this decade is called Reaganism or the Thatcher Revolution, whatever you want to call it. And it's basically a form of free market capitalism and neoliberalism, which are economic philosophies that state that markets should be as free as possible from state intervention. Literally free market capitalism. Fun fact, I wrote a paper during my master's about Reagan's response to the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. And I got invited to present it at a conference in New York, which then got canceled because of the pandemic. Unrelated. Anyway, the neoliberal shift that happened in the 1980s were marked by a few big changes. In no particular order, the first one was cutting taxes, especially for the wealthy and for corporations, basically to encourage investment and growth. And so this was great for Wall Street because it increased profits and increased stock market returns, but it weakened the public sector and unions. Speaking of unions, that was another change during this era because labor unions were significantly weakened. Reagan and Thatcher both saw labor unions as obstacles to efficiency, and so they passed policies that weakened labor unions' power. Obviously, labor unions represent the interests of the workers, so by weakening them, they reduced workers' bargaining power, they froze wages, and they shifted power away from employees and workers and their interests. So the political and the cultural focus behind this move was to go from protecting workers to rewarding competition. If Joe Prosciutto's wage is not good, then he can get up and go and find another job, rather than going through his union who would advocate on his behalf. Another element of 1980s neoliberalism was deregulated industries. This was a shift that removed a lot of rules that limited banks, corporations, markets, and literally this was like free market capitalism. So what happened with this deregulation was that finance expanded rapidly, and money itself, this might sound a little bit abstract, but money basically turned into a product to trade and invest. The economy largely became driven by credit and consumption rather than what it was previously being driven by, which was wages and production. And people were now being urged to spend and to borrow and to invest. And this became marketed as a new form of economic freedom. If you invest and spend money, and if you don't have the money, you have to borrow it and use credit to be able to spend, then that's what you got to do, because that is you exercising your freedom. Another element of neoliberalism, especially in the UK, was privatization. The privatization of the public sector. For example, something that Margaret Thatcher became very famous for was the right to buy scheme under the Housing Act, which essentially allowed tenants who are living in public housing, I think in the UK the term was charter homes, if I'm not mistaken, but essentially the people who were living in public housing were able to buy those homes from the government for a discounted price. And the rationale behind this was that Thatcher wanted to turn Britain from a nation of renters to a nation of owners. Because ownership is a form of pride and freedom and power, and it gave people a sense of independence. And what happened was over 2 million of these houses were sold. But the thing is, local governments were not allowed to use the money from those sales to build new homes. And so as a result, the supply of affordable housing collapsed. So all these things put together, especially the deregulation and the weakened unions and the focus on ownership, these all strengthen the view that people should act as consumers and investors, not as dependents on the state. You are your own free actor, and the ultimate source of freedom is for you to be able to spend your money however you like, especially to be able to own things. And if you don't have the money to do that, then you can borrow it and use credit. Underlying all of this rhetoric and all of this philosophy and this mindset is the idea that freedom means choice. The freedom to buy, to sell, to own. You're exercising your choice. Freedom, America. These are all hallmarks of a strong, free Western democracy. And people were encouraged to see themselves as individual consumers, not as members of a working class, not as workers or people who kept the system alive by providing their labor, but as people who kept the system alive by providing their money by spending it. Of course, there were a lot of economic and social factors that played into this as well. For example, the 1980s was a decade of crazy high inflation. So obviously there's a lot of things to take into account here. But all else being equal, we see this shift from viewing the individual and the good citizen as a worker to viewing them as a consumer. And the cultural implications of this economic shift play very deeply into our formula. While Joe Prosciutto, who was the sole breadwinner of his family, will go to work and make money to provide for his family. His wife, Angie, was the main consumer of the household, mainly by buying goods for the household. But now, today, with many women working and having their own income and having their own disposable income, we're now able to engage in capitalism, like I said, as both the worker and the consumer. And of course, we don't want to take for granted the fact that being able to work and have financial independence is one of the most important ways for women to have freedom and to not be dependent on somebody who can abuse and manipulate them. So that's really important, and that in itself is a key element of freedom. But the other part of us engaging with capitalism as the consumer, that is where that secret, shiny, sparkly, tantalizing form of enslavement is hiding itself. Like I mentioned earlier, patriarchy evolves to all these rebellions and revolutions and social movements by absorbing them into its logic. It's like this monster where you cut off its head and then two heads grow. And of course, I don't want to downplay the fact that there's been so many advances and so many things that women have fought for to basically demand from men in power to stop withholding basic rights from us. But the difficult thing about a system that is so deeply ingrained in everybody's life is that it evolves. It learns and it evolves. And I hate to say this. Like, I fucking hate saying it because, like, I want it to die. But that's what happens. And when that formula was disrupted, where women no longer needed to depend on men, the system, in a way, recalibrated itself. Because it's like, women are being free? No. Y'all, sit back down. Sit down. And it evolved by selling freedom as consumerism, when in reality, consumerism is just slavery disguised as freedom. And there's two reasons for that, especially in the case of women, the woman as the consumer. Number one is that consumerism makes us hate ourselves and relies on us hating ourselves. And the second reason is that consumerism makes women compete against each other. It pits us against one another. Because at its core, consumerism relies on women's hatred of themselves and of each other. And it manufactures that hatred because that's what keeps us spending money. So let's break down these two reasons. The first one, of consumerism relying on women hating themselves, is really important because that's how it sells us things that we don't need. We're taught that we're ugly if we don't have flawless skin that's not dry or oily and that's free of blemishes and it's got to be perfect. And that's how we get sold these stupid 10-step skincare routines that we don't need and that actually makes our skin worse. My skin was at its worst when I was doing skincare. I'm not even kidding. I just wash my face now, moisturize, sunscreen, that's it. And use tretinoin gel that my doctor prescribed me for my acne scars. That's it. That is it. I don't need anything else, and I take a daily probiotic. That's all I need. But that's not it. It's not just our skin. It's every part of ourselves and of our bodies and of our existence. We're taught to hate our bodies. We're taught to hate our hair. Or we're taught to hate every part of ourselves so that we go and buy a product that can rectify that or that can cover it up. Because we're not buying these things as a way to fix that deficiency and lack of self-love that we have. We're using that as a band-aid solution. But we don't even realize it's a band-aid solution because we think it's the actual solution. When in reality, the problem is the consumerism itself because there was nothing wrong with you to begin with. So that's the first reason. The second one is that consumerism relies on women to compete against one another. And at its core, consumerism is based on competition. It's based on competition for prestige. If you don't believe me, open your Instagram and scroll for 10 seconds and you'll find somebody flexing something. Their car, their new engagement ring, their house, whatever. Consumerism is based on the competition for prestige. And it makes you dislike other people because of envy. Because we think that if somebody has something that you don't have, then that is a deficiency on your part. If someone has a nicer house than you, a nicer car than you, if someone got a bigger engagement ring than you, if somebody went on a nicer vacation than you, then that means you are financially inadequate and you did something wrong. Because we're so brainwashed to think that everything that's in front of us is what reality is. And I say this all the time on this podcast, appearances matter more than reality. So some buffoon who is flexing on Instagram obviously knows this. They obviously know this. Maybe they took a picture of the first class cabin in a plane while they were walking through it to get to their seat in economy, to get to their seat D45 next to the bathroom. You don't know that. But that's what keeps the wheels of consumerism and competition and self-hatred moving. Okay? That the prestige, the fight for prestige is like is oiling the wheels. Bloop, 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 oiling the wheels. So that the system keeps going. Because as soon as we find out that it's all a farce, I love this word, farce, but as soon as we find out that most of this stuff is made up and that we're competing for things that don't even exist because the way that other people portray their lives is not even their lives to begin with, if we were to understand that, a lot of this would crumble. A lot of this competition would crumble. And that's why I hate when people call me an influencer. Not that many people do, but I hate that label because to me, an influencer is a puppet of consumerism. Influencers are people, at least in my mind. Maybe you are an influencer listening to this right now, and if you are, and I'm, not accurately describing you, I'm sorry. But to me, from what I've seen, I don't follow influencers anymore. It's been years, but every time I see one of these people, because they pop up here and there, it just seems so fabricated, so manufactured, so inauthentic, even when they do a voiceover on a reel, for example, it sounds so fake to me. Like they're not talking the way I do right now. I have a set of notes in bullet points. I don't have a script because I want to come out here and just talk and be authentic and speak what's on my mind and have my personality come through, because there's just so much fakeness in this world. And a lot of it is because we've been conditioned through consumerism to think that we have to present this picture perfect version of ourselves. And that's why there's so many labels and aesthetics and the clean girl and the Pilates princess and King Kylie and King Tut and whatever. Like, the reason so many women are obsessed with labels and aesthetics and they want to look a certain way, and when you see somebody and you're like, I know that everything she's wearing right now is from this store. We have these labels that we adhere to so closely, unless you listen to Law 18, of course, because so many of us can't bear to be in our own skin. So we take this pre-made label, this label that has this pre-made identity, so we don't have to do the work of finding ourselves and figuring out who we are and expressing ourselves, because it's easier to fit that mold than it is to engage in self-discovery and maybe be a little bit different from other people and maybe not be picture perfect, but still be true to yourself. And all of this, both the competition and the self-hatred that consumerism runs on, they're both really, really dangerous because they're both tied to your identity. Consumerism is the best way to keep people distracted and believing that they are free while actually quietly shaping their desires to serve the system. And it's like we're in this trance. We're in this trance that we don't even realize that we're in. Obviously, now that you've listened to this, you're probably kind of like, I hate this world. But at least now we can snap out of this trance. Because you don't know what you don't know until you figure out that, oh my God, like all of this has been, pushed on me as part of an agenda. And I sound like a wackadoodle again. I sound like the keynote speaker at the wackadoodle convention. But when the revolution comes, you're going to realize that all this consumerism is just noise. It's noise, and it's a distraction from something very fundamental that we already know as women, that we already know. And I'm going to leave you baddies on that cliffhanger. Goodbye.